Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. I'm Kevin Lam, Curator of Chinese Art at ACM. Welcome to ACM and welcome to ACM Conversations, a series of monthly talks. This series brings leading scholars, cultural practitioners, artisans in Singapore and from abroad in conversation with curators and educators in ACM. This talk series would not have been possible without the generous sponsorship of Royal Insignia, a premier luxury brand for medals, jewelry, and fine gifts for members of the world's royal families and international ministries. So today is the first talk, or the first two talks, held in conjunction with our special exhibition, Pagoda Odyssey 1915. As the curator of this exhibition, I would insist you to visit it. But no matter if you have visited it or you are going to visit it, I'm sure, definitely, the two talks this evening will help you to understand a lot more about the exhibition, or maybe even discover some secrets that the ACM is not aware of. So we are honored to have two distinguished guests, speakers from the Ritchie Institute of Boston College, to speak to us about the intriguing history of the Jesuits in China and the impact of these cross-cultural exchanges. So our first speaker this evening is Father Anthony Uchella. He's currently the director of the Ritchie Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History and associate professor of history at Boston College. Thank you, Father Uchella.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Father Uchella has published extensively, his most recent book being The Samurai and the Cross, the Jesuit Enterprise in Early Modern Japan. I have to add, besides being an accomplished scholar, Father Uchella is also a fellow curator. In 2016, he co-curated a major exhibition at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco called China at the Center. And the second speaker this evening is Dr. Wu Xiaoxian Thank you. Dr. Wu is the Director of Research at the Ritchie Institute, Boston College. His research and publication focus on Chinese Western cultural and historical exchanges through Western missionary experiences in China and archival resources. His publications include Christianity in China, a scholar's guide to resources in the libraries and archives of the United States, and collections of historical sources on Christianity in China. He also serves as co-chief editor of studies in the history of Christianity in East Asia. So this evening, Father Uchella will speak first, followed by Dr. Wu. And after each talk, we'll have time for Q&A. So start thinking about questions. And this, without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Father Anthony, to start. The title of his talk is Jesuit Missionaries and Mandarins at the Heart of the Middle Kingdom. Thank you, Father Uchella.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you can't hear me, then you can let me know. Well, good evening, everyone. It is truly wonderful to be back for the first time in this beautiful city of yours here in Singapore, the jewel that is the garden city of the Merlion. So I would like to begin with a very special thanks to all our hosts here at the Asian Civilisations Museum. Director Kenny Ting, incoming Director Clement On, curator of the exhibit Kevin Lam, and his team, including Grace Tung and Melissa Wiswani, and all those who worked so hard behind the scenes to make this evening and this exhibit possible. And a special word of sincere gratitude goes to the Chief Executive Officer of the National Heritage Board of Singapore, Ms. Zhang Hui Ni, for supporting this initiative. And I would like to also thank the Honorable George Yeo, former Foreign Minister of the Republic of Singapore, who honors us this evening with his presence. It's wonderful to speak about Christian East-West encounters in a city that is truly a living reflection of such amazing cultural, religious, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. My colleague, Dr. Wu Xiaoxian, and I are deeply honored to have this opportunity to deliver these lectures this evening. But time is of the essence, so let's dive right in. In the new exhibit that just opened, we have the portraits that came from the Ricci Institute at Boston College of a Chinese literatus and 3 prominent Jesuit missionaries who would find their way to the heart of the Ming and the Qing empires. First, in the Ming dynasty, we have the Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci. And then Xu Guangqi, the first Chinese scholar in Mandarin to convert to Christianity in the 16th century. And then, following the transition to the Qing dynasty, we have the German Jesuit Johann Adam Schall von Bell and the Flemish Jesuit Ferdinand Verbiest. But we must begin by asking, were there any missionaries or Christians in China before the Ming dynasty, when the Jesuits about whom we will be speaking first arrived in the Middle Kingdom? We learn about such a presence from Marco Polo's writings about his travels in Asia, undertaken with his father, Niccolò Polo, and his paternal uncle, Matteo Polo, Venetian merchants and travelers between 1271 and 1295. He recounts his experiences at the court of Kublai Khan, the greatest Eastern ruler of the time, whom Marco would serve for almost 17 years. Here we see a manuscript from the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford that depicts Marco, Niccolò, and Maffeo Polo presenting the letters of the Pope to Kublai Khan. In 1286, Arghun, the Mongolian Ilkhan of Persia, sent a request to the Pope through a monk of the Assyrian Church of the East, asking for Catholic missionaries to be sent to the court of the great Emperor Kublai Khan. Thereafter, Christians constituted a significant minority in their kingdom and were tolerated by their rulers. Pope Nicholas IV received the letter in 1287. As a result, the Franciscan missionary Giovanni di Montecorvino was sent to Beijing, then known as Khan Balik in Mongolian. He established a church there in 1299 and again in 1305, and is considered the founder of the Catholic Church in China. Marco Polo was still present at the time. This history made Pope Francis's recent visit to Mongolia all the more meaningful. The honor guard that greeted him was very friendly, but looked no less fierce than in the 13th century, in their full armor parading on horseback. The Pope met with the Mongolian president inside a traditional ger or yurt, a tradition that Marco Polo would have been familiar with. But we must go back even further in time. A commemorative stele or stone monument dating back to 781 in the Tang Dynasty was discovered around 1623. The engraved heading reads, "Memorial Stele of the Propagation in China of the Luminous Religion of the Roman Empire." It indicates that Eastern Christianity, or the Assyrian Church of the East, had reached the Chinese capital Xi'an as early as 635, during the Tang Dynasty, hundreds of years before the Mongol Yuan Dynasty or Marco Polo's travels. Thus, Christians had been present in China for almost 1,000 years before Ricci first arrived. The Chinese Christian convert Li Zhizhao of Hangzhou informed the Jesuits about its discovery and first published its text in Chinese in 1625. A Portuguese Jesuit, Álvaro Semedo, then reported back to Europe on the finding of the stele. Nicolas Trigault, a Flemish Jesuit, seen here in Peter Paul Rubens's famous sketch from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, first translated its content into Latin. The Jesuit Manuel Diaz the Younger, or Yang Manuo, subsequently composed a treatise on the stele in Chinese in 1644. Early European geographical knowledge of China is depicted on this early Renaissance world map, a planisphere dating from around 1450 and attributed to the Venetian monk Fra Mauro. This treasure, which is over 2 meters high, in fact, what you see on the screen is just slightly larger than the original, can be admired in the museum adjacent to the Library of St. Mark, namely the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. It depicts the so-called ekumene, a Greek expression that refers to the entire world with all lands known at the time in Europe, the equivalent of what the Chinese would call the Tianxia, all under heaven. Herein, we find the first references to Tartaria, or Tartary, the lands occupied by the Mongols whom we've been talking about. It is also where we get the word Cathay, or Cathayo, an early European designation for northern China, ruled by the Mongols. I would sincerely hope that the CEO of Cathay Pacific Airways in Hong Kong is aware of the origin of his airline's name, and if not, shame on him. As you well know, missionaries arrived in these parts in the 16th century aboard Portuguese ships. The route from Lisbon to the east was truly an arduous one. It took them through Mozambique, Goa, Malacca, Macau, all the way up to Nagasaki. After the Middle Ages, among the first missionaries to venture to Asia, beginning with India, the Malay Peninsula, and Indonesia, was Francis Xavier, who made his way then to Japan. The painting you see here was produced at the Jesuit Painting Academy in Nagasaki and is now in the Kobe City Museum in Japan. His authentic signature that you see here is preserved in the archives of the Society of Jesus in Rome. On his final journeys in 1552, we have records that attest that Francis Xavier passed through the Straits of Singapore on his way to China. The peoples he encountered in Southeast Asia are poignantly depicted in this beautiful painting preserved in Lisbon. Here at the ACM, we can admire this beautiful panel showing a crab retrieving St. Francis Xavier's cross after a storm. But that story is much less mysterious to me as a visitor than the reason that motivated Singapore to name their police robot after the Jesuit missionary and saint. But let us return to the 16th century and to our story. Xavier had been hoping to find passage to China to preach there, but he fell ill and died on the southern island of Shangchuan within sight of the Chinese Guangdong mainland without fulfilling his dream. The year he died, however, was the year Matteo Ricci was born. He would fulfill that dream. So who was Ricci, Xavier's successor, who inspired and continues to inspire many to engage in dialogue and intercultural and interfaith exchange? We know that he came to be regarded and respected as an upright man of great virtue and the gentleman scholar who had traveled thousands of leagues from the Great West, the Daxi, as the Chinese referred to his homeland. But what he continues to be remembered for to this day was that he befriended the Chinese people in a spirit of openness and respect and was willing not only to learn from them, but also to be transformed at a deep personal level by this encounter. And therein, perhaps, we shall uncover his greatest legacy. The story of Ricci's journey to China begins a generation after Xavier with another great Italian missionary, Alessandro Valignano, who died in Macau, China in 1606, just as he was preparing to embark on a journey to the Chinese mainland to visit Matteo Ricci. He supported Ricci's work for over 2 decades, and Ricci would later refer to him as the father of the Chinese mission. Valignano had known Ricci since their first meeting in Rome in 1571, when he had briefly acted as his substitute novice master. In August 1573, the new General Superior of the Order, Everard Mercurian, appointed Valignano to be his visitor, that is, his personal delegate, to all Jesuit missions in the East Indies, from Mozambique to Goa, Malacca, Macau, and Japan. In 1579, Valignano composed a report, a summary on the Indies, shortly after his arrival in Japan. Let's now listen to what he had to say about his first experience of the Middle Kingdom.
The Kingdom of China is very different from any other kingdom or eastern province, and upon setting foot in it, one gets the impression of entering a totally new world. It is very similar to Europe, and yet it is more advanced in many ways. First of all, China is very vast and has only one king, who is the richest and most powerful king anywhere in the world, and the whole kingdom, with all its towns, cities, and even villages, all belong to the King of China, who has officials in every part of the country who are known as mandarins. Some of these are in charge of affairs relating to war and have been nobles and mandarins for generations, and they advance in dignity according to their achievements. Yet others are responsible for the government of the land, as well as the administration of justice and the welfare of the people. These mandarins achieve their positions of dignity only by merit of their virtuous conduct and learning, which is held in even greater esteem in China than in Europe. And as official positions of honor and government are only granted to the literati, all strive to excel in letters, which is why China is the best governed kingdom of any in existence.
Quite a remark to make by an Italian nobleman very proud of his own culture. As a result, Valignano first decided to send two Italian Jesuits, Michele Ruggeri and Matteo Ricci, to Macau to begin to learn Chinese, something the Portuguese, who were already resident there, thought of as a folly and a hopeless enterprise. Let's listen to what Valignano has to say about the arrangements he made.
There are already two fathers, Ruggeri and Ricci, here in Macau studying the language, and they are making great progress. We can confidently hope that their efforts will not be in vain. For this purpose, I've provided them with teachers and with a separate house, and with all the necessary means and leisure to dedicate themselves wholly to this task.
In the Roman archives of the Society of Jesus, this first Portuguese-Chinese dictionary and Chinese primer composed by Ruggeri and Ricci has been preserved, and you see it here. We are also fortunate to have this language practice sheet entirely in Ricci's own hand. His Chinese characters are not bad, and they're not great. He's still learning at this stage, including transcriptions of the pronunciation of each character, the first time anyone ever devised a romanization system to represent Chinese sounds. Soon Ruggeri, his companion who had arrived earlier, was attempting to compose a catechism for the Chinese. Pedro Gomez, who would later go to Japan and help to establish the first Jesuit college on the island of Kyushu, reports to Rome as follows.
During these months I've spent here in Macau, Father Ruggeri and I have been busy preparing a brief history of the world, together with a book of Christian doctrine in dialogue format that will be translated into Chinese.
Ruggeri's catechism, a landmark achievement by a non-native Chinese speaker, was printed in classical Chinese in 1584. It included an appendix with the first translation of the Ten Commandments and also of different prayers, such as the Hail Mary and the Our Father, first translated into Chinese. At first, Valignano was very enthusiastic about this edition and hoped it could be used in Japan as well. on account of being composed in classical Chinese, the lingua franca of East Asia, not unlike Latin and Greek in the West. And this is what he had to say.
The catechism that was composed in the Chinese language will also be of great help to the learned bonzes, and that is why I have written to China instructing them to send numerous copies to Japan.
But 10 years later, he would say just the opposite.
Father Ruggeri knows very little of the Chinese language and its literature. Father Matteo Ricci, who has now mastered Chinese very well, is preparing another catechism that will be a much more suitable and well-arranged translation than that of Father Ruggeri.
Well, so what had happened during those intervening years to make him change his mind so radically? Well, one reason for Valignano's change in opinion of Ruggeri's catechism had a lot to do with Ruggeri's insistence on adopting the dress, culture, and language of Buddhist monks, who were not very well respected in China at the time, and this worried Valignano. The colophon, namely the very last line of Ruggeri's catechism, was a problem on account of how he described himself.
天竺国僧闵见书
So, composed by the monk from India, Mingjian, where Ruggeri's full Chinese name was Luo Mingjian. Now, the problem is Seng, which could easily be confused, obviously, with Buddhist monks, especially since India, Tianzhu, was also mentioned. And that is, in fact, where both Ruggeri and Ricci had come from physically, subsequently stopping in Malacca before arriving in Macau. Thus, Ruggeri was sent packing back to Europe, and Ricci was instructed to compose a new work, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, the Tianzhu Shi Yi, which was first composed in the 1590s and then printed in 1603. It would soon become a key reference point for Confucian literati interested in coming to a better understanding of the Christian faith. It would also have a major influence on scholars in Japan and in particular in Korea, where they first read this Christian work. In a letter written from Beijing, Ricci himself acknowledges its influence even beyond the shores of China.
It gave us great consolation to know that many of our works written in Chinese characters were useful in Japan on account of their use of the same characters. For this reason, Father Valignano reprinted my catechism in Canton in order to have it sent to Japan, and Father Francesco Pasio has requested that I send him many of these books, for they have great authority in Japan insofar as they come from China.
Valignano could not forget how Francis Xavier had first adopted Buddhist language in Japan, translating the word God with Dainichi Nyorai, the Japanese word for the cosmic Buddha taken from esoteric Buddhism, a cultural, linguistic, and religious misunderstanding that Valignano had no intention of repeating in China. So Valignano thought that Ricci's works could also serve the purpose of preaching through books and engaging in dialogue with the learned Buddhist monks of Japan. Ricci then goes on to explain, in his native Italian, his entire scholarly strategy of engaging with the Chinese mandarins and why he considered it of paramount importance to do so.
And it is for this reason that I do everything so that our fathers study very well the books of China and learn how to compose in Chinese. For to tell the truth, which may be hard to believe, one accomplishes more in China with books than with words. Più si fa nella Cina con libri che con parole. What follows is the ease with which we can spread our holy Christian religion with books, which can enter everywhere without any obstacles. And so it is that as these books spread, they speak to more people and with greater consideration and precision than we can by word of mouth. And of this we have undeniable experience. In fact, our holy law, or at least a good opinion of it, has spread further by means of the 4 or 5 books that we have printed than by mere words or any other means hitherto employed by us.
Here Ricci reveals how he understood the importance of the written word and its rhetorical impact in Chinese culture versus the spoken word, which is very important, obviously, in Greek and Roman rhetoric. And he understood this difference. But what about Ricci's own library? We know that among his books, Ricci had in his possession a reprint of a famous atlas first published in 1570 by Abraham Ortelius, the famous cartographer from Antwerp, who ushered in the Dutch golden age of geography and cartography, which would be a key reference point for the Jesuits. Ricci's copy was a reprint dating back from the 1590s, which he would end up radically adapting to his new scholarly audience in Beijing. This projection of the world by Ortelius, which we are all familiar with in the West, places Europe and the Atlantic at the center, thereby dividing the world into hemispheres and placing China and the rest of Asia to the very far east, hence the expression adopted in the West since the 16th century. Well, that wouldn't do. Ricci knew this would not be acceptable to the learned inhabitants of the Middle Kingdom, not the Far East, or to the imperial court. Thus, his creative scientific work included composing a new world map, which the Chinese had never seen before, and which included a wealth of scientific information, both astronomical and even geological, besides the geographical data. It was entitled A Complete Map of the Myriad Kingdoms of the Globe, the Kunyu Wangguo Quantu, and was first printed in 1602. He translated all geographical names into Chinese and placed China and the Pacific at the center, literally creating a new worldview that was no longer Eurocentric and also more in tune with the Chinese worldview. And actually, Singapore is really closer to the very center on this particular map, because China is a little bit too far to the north. These maps were sought after by Japanese and Korean scholars for centuries to come. In fact, this colored map was produced in 1604 in Japan, only 2 years after Ricci's original 1602 version. In Korea, various abridged versions of this world map were reprinted until the 19th century. Here is another version of the map, printed in 1785 by Japan's foremost cartographer of the Edo period, Nakakubo Sekisui, in spite of the proscription of Christianity. The Ricci Institute possesses a copy of the previous map as well as this late Edo period hand-drawn and hand-colored copy dating from as late as 1842. Many other versions were either printed or hand-copied onto large screens in Japan. Some became much sought-after luxury items by wealthy merchants, scholars, and the nobility alike, such as this large copy decorated with gold leaf. And even the royal court in Joseon, Korea, under the orders of King Sukjong, had it reprinted by the Royal Bureau of Astronomy in 1708. The current copy that you see here is preserved in the Kyujanggak Royal Library and now National Archives at Seoul National University. Ricci also put to good use the scientific knowledge he had acquired at the Roman College in Italy when he was a student of the famous astronomer and mathematician Christopher Clavius, who had engaged with and was very well respected by Galileo Galilei. In one of his final works entitled A History of the Entry of the Society of Jesus and Christianity into China, He has much to say about their common interest in science and how it impacted his special relationship with Xu, who also became his first convert among the literati. Let's now hear how Ricci describes his first convert and good friend and what they did together.
Dr. Paul, whose sole concern seems to be to find a way for our fathers and the culture of our lands to be accepted with authority, in order to promote further Christianity, consulted Father Matteo on how to translate some of our books dealing with the natural sciences. He thus hoped to demonstrate to the literati of this kingdom the extent of our diligence in investigating all phenomena and the solid foundations on which we base our affirmations and proofs. And in this way, they would come to understand that also with regard to our holy religion, we had not been moved to follow it without reason. And as we spoke of various books, we decided that for now it would be best to translate the elements of Euclid.
This was precisely one of the books that he had studied in Rome under Clavius, who edited a new edition of the work in 1574. And so together, in 1607, Ricci and Xu produced the first translation of Euclid into Chinese. The word they adopted to translate the word geometry, or jihe, is still used today, not only in Chinese, but also in Japanese as kikangaku and in Korean as kihahak. Besides translating the terminology used by Euclid, it also reproduced and adapted a number of the diagrams of the original edition with Chinese annotations. In the preface, there is a curious reference that reads, "The Western scholar Li Ma Dou orally dictated the text, while the Chinese scholar Xu Guangqi received the dictation with his brush." Hence, we have an initial oral translation by Ricci, Kou Yi, and a polishing of the text in Chinese by Xu, Bi Shou. It is this spirit of collaboration and the common pursuit of knowledge, both human and divine, that characterizes Ricci's interactions with the many scholars he befriended. And that is why this missionary and Mandarin are so often depicted together. And so, too, the two portraits in the present exhibit form an inseparable pair. And when we were talking about how to display them in the gallery, both Dr. Wu and myself said, oh, they have to be together, because that's how they are also at the entrance of the Ricci Institute at Boston College. So, Ricci himself comments on this in a rare letter that has been preserved that he wrote to his own father back in Macerata, Italy, Giovanni Battista Ricci. The cityscape seen here in a painting by the famed contemporary Chinese artist Li Jinyuan.
My task consists of continuously making and receiving visits to and from scholars who come in an uninterrupted stream to ask about our faith and our science. Every day I teach 1, 2, and sometimes 3 lessons for Jesuits who are learning Chinese characters, or to those from outside who want to learn our science. I preach on the Christian feast days, and I always try to write something in Chinese.
But Ricci goes further in his thinking. He came to believe that the Chinese exceeded in their virtue other ancient civilizations, including his own. The key is following the dictates of conscience that are part of a common humanity, and this is how he puts it.
In ancient times, they, that is the Chinese, followed the natural law more fully than in our countries. And 1500 years ago, this people was not inclined to the worship of idols. And those they did adore were not like the evil idols worshipped by the Egyptians, Greeks, or Romans, but rather men whom they considered virtuous and who had performed many good deeds. On the contrary, the books of the literati, which are the most ancient and authoritative among their writings, do not adore anything but heaven and earth, and the Lord of both. And if we examine these books, we will find little therein against the light of reason, and much that is in conformity with it. And we can hope in divine mercy, and that many of their ancient sages were saved by their observance of the natural law, with the help that God would have given them on account of their goodness.
It was this spirit of Ricci that animated subsequent generations of Jesuits who, building on the foundation of goodwill that he had created, would reach the highest echelons of the imperial court in their service to both the Ming and the newly established Qing dynasties. One of those, depicted in a painting in this exhibit, is Charles von Bell, a German Jesuit and astronomer who would become a close advisor and confidant of the young Shunzhi Emperor. He participated in modifying the Chinese calendar and compiling what is known as the Chongzhen calendar, named after the last emperor of the Ming dynasty. The modified calendar provided more accurate predictions of eclipses of the sun and the moon. He was made a mandarin and held an important post in connection with the mathematical school, director of the Imperial Observatory and the Tribunal of Mathematics. Here you can see in a dramatization the Shunzhi boy emperor who would call Charles Mafa or grandpa, a level of familiarity shown to a foreigner at the Chinese court that was absolutely unheard of. But the emperor died from smallpox at the age of 22, and the Jesuits' enemies at court seized the opportunity to accuse them of treason and had them condemned to death. During their subsequent imprisonment, Charles suffered from a stroke and was incapacitated. And so it was left to Charles' younger colleague and successor, the Flemish Jesuit Ferdinand Verbiest, to defend the Jesuits, but to no avail. All seemed lost, until an earthquake struck Beijing. Interpreted as a sign of heaven's displeasure and a bad omen, the execution was not carried out and the missionaries were saved. The Kangxi Emperor restored the Jesuits' position at court and put Verbiest in charge of the astronomical observatory once again. Unfortunately, Charles died within a year thereafter, unable to recover from the ill treatment he had suffered while in prison. Verbiest's rehabilitation and new appointment allowed him to rebuild the observatory in 1873. As part of this process, he also designed 6 new instruments. All of them can still be seen at the old observatory or the Guguanxiangtai in Beijing today. A truly massive and monumental building which has survived the vicissitudes of time. The instruments that Verbiest designed and cast in bronze are perfectly preserved on the roof of the complex, where visitors can still admire them today. Each instrument is meticulously described in a work that Verbiest printed in Chinese, explaining the use of each of these remarkable new instruments that he created in bronze, and which he also described for a European audience in the 1687 imprint from Germany. Together with Charles, Verbiest introduced not only scientific instruments, but also the Tychonic system of astronomy to China, Japan, and Korea. He wrote works such as this treatise on the optics of the telescope, seen here in a Japanese Edo period manuscript in the possession of the Ricci Institute at Boston College. Verbiest also made a world map in 1674, but composed it as 2 separate hemispheres, including representation of the world's flora and fauna. The Jesuits serving as scientists at the imperial court of China throughout the reigns of various emperors were respected by the court, which allowed them to continue their primary work of evangelization as Christian missionaries. Finally, I would be remiss if speaking at a museum I did not mention the great Italian Jesuit missionary and court painter Giuseppe Castiglione, and here you see a number of his works. Even today, when many Chinese people see the extraordinary works that he painted, they know him not by his European name, but by his Chinese name, Lang Shining. Castiglione would serve not one, not two, but three different emperors, whose portraits in both formal and informal settings he would paint. First, the Kangxi Emperor, and then the Yongzheng Emperor, and finally, the Qianlong Emperor, during whose reign alone he would produce several hundred works of art. Adept at painting animals and plants in beautifully composed settings, he is especially famed for his paintings of groups of horses, as well as individual portraits of horses, often prized imperial possessions. Castiglione was also one of several Jesuits who designed the famed gardens with Western-style water fountains for the Qianlong Emperor at the Yuanmingyuan Summer Palace in Beijing. They were a hybrid combination of architectural symbols, East and West, with European-style fountains that included statues of the 12 zodiac signs, each of which spouted water, and elaborately manicured and terraced gardens. They were tragically plundered and destroyed during the Second Opium War in 1860 by invading British and French troops. But what remains of them can still be admired today. As we sum up this exploration of the Jesuit missionaries and mandarins at the heart of the Middle Kingdom, I would like to paraphrase a comment on an important defining characteristic of Ricci's life made by Professor Luigi Minini, director of the Ricci Institute in Macerata, Ricci's hometown. I believe that what he has to say also applies to the other missionaries that came after him.
In short, it was all about a very particular capacity to stand before his own dreams and the established image of his own identity. In other words, he possessed a special ability to become a stranger to himself, that is, not to close in exclusively on his own desires or previously held opinions, so that he might acquire the ability to encounter others as they truly are in their diversity. To do this required inner discipline. He first needed to become master of his own inner world so that he could serenely reach out to others.
And thus we come back to the four portraits displayed here at the Asian Civilisations Museum in this exhibit. Xu Guangqi, Ricci's first convert, helped him to do just that, become a stranger to himself and transform his identity into a new one. And this is what he also left as his greatest legacy to his successors. Thus, Ricci was no longer. He had become Li Ma Dou. Johann Adam Schall von Bell had become Tang Zhuo Wang. And Ferdinand Verbiest was now Nan Huaizhen. While I must now bring this presentation to a close, the story does not end there. Xu Guangqi and his descendants continued to support missionaries and even donated part of their lands in Shanghai at Zikawei to the Jesuits. What they did in later centuries is another story, one that you will soon hear about from my colleague, Dr. Wu Xiaoxin, and which is at the center of the ACM's new exhibit, Pagoda Odyssey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Uchella, for this dynamic and captivating talk. You provide the story of the Jesuits within a Pan-Asian context, and thanks for your advice not to separate Richie from Xu Guangqi. And I also want to add, it is based on Father Uchella's advice that we put Xu Guangqi at the very first, at the second section. So as a kind of a symbolic introduction to the region of Xujiahui, which Dr. Wu Xiaoxian will talk more about. So, I will ask Father Uchella to stay on stage. Now, we would like to invite questions from our audience. Just raise your hand. And,
Yes, hello. I understand one of Kublai Khan's wives was a Nestorian Christian. So I'm just wondering what was the relationship between the Jesuits and the Nestorian Christians or the Assyrian Christians?
As far as I'm aware, and this is not exactly my principal area of expertise, but as far as I'm aware, there was no connection at that time, because this is 1,000 years later. So what happened was that so this was uncovered in 781, and or was made in 781. It was uncovered in between 1623-24, and then once it became known, one of the converts, Li Zhizao, immediately published that, and he told the Jesuits that this had been discovered. And then one of the Portuguese Jesuits, Manuel Dias, was able, again, a number of years later, almost 20 years later actually, publish a version of the Chinese text as well. And then Nicolas Trigot, as I mentioned, published a Latin translation of it. But there was, as far as I know, no relationship in the sense that there was no contact we are aware of. I think it was a discovery that there had been this group, and it was a major discovery also for the Chinese in the 17th century. Anything else?
Thank you very much. My question has to do with the process of building trust, because today there is so much dialogue around intercultural competencies and how that promotes trust building. So based on what we know, what were the behaviors that the Jesuits adopted to be able to establish that trust? I mean, it's not an easy feat. So based on what we know, the letters, how would you summarize this composite of behaviors that help them build trust in China?
Well, thank you for this actually wonderful question, because it really, first of all, connects to the present day. So sometimes in my principal area of expertise is the history of Christianity in Japan and its connections with China and Korea. And one of the things that sometimes people ask is, what's the point of history? Although Chinese never ask that question. Everyone certainly in the Chinese world and also in other Asian contexts understand the importance of history very well, but sometimes others do not. And I think that one of the points here, and the reason I'm here and the reason I traveled 15,000 kilometers to come here and to do this, and to work with the Asian Art Museum, or Asian Civilisations Museum, sorry, the Asian Art Museum is in San Francisco, is because I really feel that this sort of collaboration helps us to reflect together on what is the meaning of all this for the present day. Why am I quoting things that somebody wrote in the 17th century? And I think that what they teach us and what the relevance is and what the competence was, first of all, learn the languages. It's number one. I actually, coming here, if you don't mind me sharing this, I was extremely moved just getting on the MRT in Singapore and seeing, you know, the English and then the Malay, the Chinese, and the Tamil. So what an amazing combination. So learn the languages, I think, and this is what they did, and it's a painstaking process. I've been a missionary in Japan for many years, so I know the difficulty of learning these different languages. So one key attitude is also patience. You cannot, you know, we're in a world where everything has to take place in a few seconds. Well, this takes years. It actually takes decades. And one of the things that people don't realize, you know, now we talk about all of Richie's accomplishments, but he spent years in solitude, learning the language, trying to communicate, not being always able to do that. You know, you saw his very first primer of Chinese characters. He wasn't very good at it at the beginning. It took time. That's one thing. I think the second attitude is humility. No, I don't understand everything in the world. No, I do not understand every other culture. That's number two, I think, attitude of humility. If you're going to learn the language and have this attitude of humility, you have to have patience. It's number three. Things take time. You will make mistakes. You learn from those mistakes. You recover from your mistakes. You also allow others to be generous enough to absorb your mistakes in order for communication to take place. So I think that's another very important element. Fourthly, I would say openness to learn from the other person. Again, all of these things are so contemporary and so relevant, and not to be so judgmental. So one of the things that I said at the end is about, in a way, losing yourself, which of course Richie was still Richie. I mean, he knew who he was, he didn't lose his identity, and yet he did in a way, and he became someone else. When people talk about intercultural contacts, I think, or being intercultural people, if you learn another language, you go to another place, you learn another culture, and you encounter, for example, other religions. I do a lot of work with Buddhist monks and Shinto priests in Japan. What do you discover? You discover that you're becoming a different person because you're being enriched by what others are teaching you. And so rather than look at, you know, people like two-dimensional cutouts, in fact, I think that this experience is people being transformed. And that's why at the end I took away their Western names and just put the Chinese name. And most Chinese don't know them except through their Chinese names, which is very telling, actually. So there is a transformative process. I don't know whether that's helpful, but thank you. It's my favorite question. I could talk about this for an hour. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Father. I was privileged to visit the graves of Matteo Ricci in Beijing and his fellow missionaries, and they were extremely well maintained on government property. That must say something about the accord and appreciation given to Matteo and his friends. My question is, what was the conflict of interest that they might have faced when the imperialists came to China, and how did they, what are the lessons we could learn about how did they balance that out?
Sorry, how did who balance what
Matteo Ricci and his fellow missionaries would have worked in a time when the imperialists were trying to come into China, and then they would have to balance that interest out about sharing knowledge and being friends with the government of the day and the new friends that they've made, new converts. And that was a tightrope, no doubt. What are the lessons we could learn? And if I might, just one other question, what do we know from records and the evidence that we have about Matteo Ricci's own spirituality? Thanks.
Yes, it's not an easy question because, of course, you have the Portuguese present in Macau. But one thing that I always, as I teach this global history, I always tell students, Macau was never a colony. It was a territory that was conceded to the Portuguese for trade. But all the Chinese had to do was cut off the water and food supply, and they were dead. So I think that relationship was a complex one. For example, Malacca was different. Malacca was conquered by the Portuguese in 1511. Goa was conquered by the Portuguese in 1510. Macau was not conquered. It was given as a trading post. However, you are right, there were certainly pressures building up, particularly in the late 16th, 17th century, about the possibility of projects of conquest, though, for example, Spain never really was interested in that, even though some people proposed, well, in order to have religious freedom in China and Japan, there should be Spanish troops that go there. Well, they may have come up with such harebrained ideas, but and I've actually looked for these documents in the Spanish archives, the kings of Spain never wanted to do that. So in the subsequent centuries, of course, as you know, particularly in the 18th century, and this is after Ricci's time, then you'll have, the British and the French will come in, and it'll be a totally different situation where there will be these unequal treaties, and of course there will be a lot of also violence. So, regardless of that, I would say that it was not easy, because of course even Ricci had to sometimes flee from where he was. If the local governor changed, who said, well, why is there a foreigner living here? I mean, you were not supposed to live in China. Basically you were in some ways an illegal immigrant. So, you had to flee. And often he had to flee and find another governor who would allow him to live in one place, and then so he went from Zhaoqing to Nanchang to Nanjing, and it was very, very difficult. I do think, and not everybody might agree, but I do think that being Italian really helped in some ways, because Italy was not a colonial power, and so it was not. And the missionaries were not, even though they were under the patronage of Portugal, they were not part of that project. And it's not, I think, not a coincidence that many of these Italians really were very creative and also very able in terms of learning Chinese or Japanese, although there were other Portuguese and Spaniards who were also very good at it. But they had a more personal, I think, conflict, whereas the Italians didn't. Italy was, divided into little kingdoms. They didn't have this personal issue. The spirituality of Ricci is a very interesting question. The first thing that comes up is, I think, is a spirituality actually of solitude, a contemplative one. We think of him, of course, he mentions that he has to meet all these people and talk to them constantly, but at the same time it was very lonely in many ways, because he had to listen to others and answer their questions, and yet, he did not have really time for himself. And in the earlier years, he actually couldn't speak to anybody, and there were very few Jesuits with him, almost none, in fact. So a spirituality of solitude, a spirituality of friendship. It was befriending other people, and that takes a lot of effort. And a spirituality also of patience. I think just knowing that everything that he's trying to do, it may work, it may not work, he may have to change what he's doing. I think this was quite a challenge. So I think those elements that I spoke about earlier might also describe that.
Yeah, the last question.
Thank you. In your lecture, you mentioned how he kind of felt that the written word was going to be more pervasive in terms of spreading the word than the spoken word. I'm just wondering whether the Jesuits missionaries actually thought of printing the Bible in China in the Chinese language at the time that they went there. And I cannot recall when the first printed Bible came about in China. I was involved with smuggling Bibles into China in the 1990s, but I forgot that part of that history. Thank you.
There were certain permissions that had to be gained in order to do this translation that started in the 17th century. But for a long time, particularly in the Catholic tradition, you were supposed to use the Latin version of the Bible. This became an issue for China. And they did start, and they did get permissions to do this, even to, for example, say the Mass in Chinese. That permission was acquired, but it took a very long time. The number of people available to do this translation were limited. Many of them were not biblical scholars. And so it didn't really happen in the 17th century. Well, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, it was Protestant missionaries who started this process. Also in Indian languages, for example. At Trankebar, there was a famous Danish printing press to translate into the languages of the Indian subcontinent, and later this also started in China. But for translations of the Bible, we have the Protestants to thank for that.
So thank you, Father Uchella. Thank you again for this dynamic and captivating talk. And
thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is my pleasure now to invite Dr. Wu Xiaoxin on the stage. The title of his talk is A Crown Jewel of the Catholic Social Enterprise in China, the Artisans of the Tushanwan Orphanage.